Okay, hopefully sound is working. Welcome back, everybody. Um, Today we'll be talking about chapter 5, which deals with personality dispositions over time. More specifically, this chapter talks about stability, coherence, and changes in personality as it takes place over time or over the lifespan. Um, so, when we think about some of the conceptual issues that this chapter raises, we'll first talk about what exactly is personality development. So, if you're like most people, you have a sense of some part of you that is enduring, a feeling that you are kind of really the same person that you are now as you were years ago. That there's something about you that kind of doesn't really change all that much. So you might be older, you might feel more experienced, you might feel more mature, but there's some certain inner quality or qualities, plural, about you that seem to kind of stay the same over the years, since you maybe even since you were born, according to some personality theorists. So in this chapter, we're gonna explore the psychological continuities and the changes that take place over time, which define the topic of personality development, this issue of personality development. When it comes to personality, there's a common saying that some things change, some things stay the same. And I guess that's a saying that we can kind of apply to life in general, right? So we'll talk about personality, the development, and the issue of stability, what kind of stays the same, change and coherence in this chapter. Um, so what is personality development? Well, personality development can be defined as those continuities, those consistencies and stabilities that people tend to exhibit over time. Um, and it could also refer to the ways in which people change over time. So, how does our personality develop as we age, as we progress through life? And each of these two facets, this idea of stability and this idea of change, require their own definitions and their own qualifications that we'll get to in a moment here. There are many forms of personality stability, and there's also many forms of personality change. There's many ways in which our personalities can stay stable, and a lot of ways in which they can change as well. And the concept of personality development tries to investigate those concepts and also those forms of stability and change. Um, Let me try to adjust my screen here. It's getting cut off a little bit. Sorry about that. So one area here is rank order stability. Also, we have mean level stability and personality coherence. So when we talk about rank order stability. This is the maintenance of individual positions within a group. So, an example might be when we think of, say, um, the ages of puberty and into early adulthood, right? So, let's say between the ages of 13 and 14 and say 20, 21, this type of time period. Um, we're still growing up until 2021. Uh, sorry for any of you in your early 20s who are not happy with your height. This is about it, unfortunately. But you will certainly learn to adapt and be happy, hopefully, with how you came out. But during this time, we'll regrow, like physically grow in terms of height. We become taller, but the rank order of heights tend to be the same. What do I mean by that? Well, just think of your friend group or your class or so. Um, your ranking in terms of height within that group of friends or within that class tends to be the same, even though you're getting taller. Your ranking stays the same because everyone else around you is getting taller as well. So if you're average height, so 5'9", if you're a male, oh, I forget the average height for a female. I'm sorry. I'm a dude, so I know the average height for me. So I'm exactly 5'9". I'm exactly average when it comes to that. Um, and chances are throughout this whole growth spurt amongst my friends, amongst my classmates, um, I would have grown proportional to my rank of averageness, right? Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. Some people who will start off short, they might be quote unquote late bloomers, so to speak, um, and have a massive growth spurt where there's all of a sudden, up in the rankings. But generally speaking, we're going this idea of rank order stability means that we kind of keep our place in the group, um, even as the group grows, right? We're growing, but the group is also growing with us as time progresses. So the same idea can actually apply to certain personality traits as well. So if people tend to maintain their positions of dominance or even extroversion relative to other members of the group, this again might be an example of rank order stability. So, as you're, let's just take a group friend. Oh, why these earbuds are bothering me so much today. Um, in terms of your personality within a group of friends, or let's say your extroversion within a group of friends, or a cohort, you might be somewhere in the middle between extroversion and introversion, but maybe you and your group of friends are kind of getting more extroverted as you grow a little older, get more comfortable with yourselves and with your bodies, and easier to approach people, particularly those who you find attractive. Um, you're still likely to maintain your rank, even though you're becoming more extroverted and more confident. Uh, so are your friends, right? So you're still kind of in the middle there, even though there's a net gain. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, we could also talk in terms of mean level stability. So this is the consistency of level within a population. So, for example, if people tend as a group to get increasingly conservative as they get older, um, then the population itself is displaying this type of mean level change. And research does suggest that as we get older, we do become conservative in some aspects, the whole like notion of conservative and liberal has kind of been turned on its head the past couple years. So I'm not sure what these terms mean anymore from a political perspective, but just in terms of openness to experiences and risk taking or adventure seeking, we tend to become more conservative as we get older, right? So this is something that we see within the population uh, in general. Always exceptions to the rules, right? And then we have personality coherence. So this is maintaining rank order in relation to others, but changing the manifestation of that trait. So if you remember from earlier lectures, we talked about how um, traits are kind of complex. They're complicated in the way, particularly the way that they are expressed. So something like aggression as a young kid might mean bullying and hitting and swearing or talking back to your parents or teachers or something. Um, but over time, it might manifest itself in different ways that you're not gonna last very long in a job or even in a long term relationship if you're bullying and hitting people and cursing at people, right? So the way that aggression is exhibited can change, and that's what we mean by manifestation, right? So a more complex form of personality development involves changing changes in the way that a trait is exhibited or the way that it manifests. So again, dominance at age 8 is expressed very differently than say dominance at age 30 or 40 or so. Um, but the trait is still there. It's just when we're talking about personality coherence, we're talking about changes not in the personality trait itself, but in the way it manifests, in the way that it's expressed. Okay, so when we talk about personality change and how personality changes, there are two defining qualities. One is internal and the other enduring. So when we say that changes are enduring, oh, I'm sorry, internal, we're saying that these changes are internal to the person, and they're not due to changes in the environment or in a person's surroundings, right? So this is different than say social psychology or social psychologist perspectives in terms of how people change is that it's usually a product of environment. Personality psychology or personality theorists will say, nope, that change is coming from within. And when we talk about enduring, the changes are enduring over time. They're not situational, right? They're not temporary. So this is two things that are pretty, like say, distinct about personality psychology, say, compared to social psychology, which I know I do a lot of comparison between the two because they both fascinate me, right? Like they're both very interested in the same things, but I don't know, they're kind of like frenemies to a sense, in a sense, right? They're both interested in the individual, and they both try to explain the way that individuals behave and think and feel and the way that we change and grow. And personality psychology is more interested in the internal processes and the internal mechanisms and um, that are involved, and social psychologists are more interested in the environmental or situational aspects that are involved. So it's always interesting, even when I'm just doing a lecture here. It always gets my brain thinking, so that's why I tend to ramble too much. And these lectures are always too long. But when it comes to personality change, they're within us according to personality theorists. They're not due to the environment, and they tend to stick around. So they're not temporary. We don't change just as the situation needs us to, um, or that we need to in order to get through a situation or a particular environment. They tend to be enduring. They tend to last. Okay. We could also evaluate personality change or personality development, because personality development is not just about change, it's also about stability. We can evaluate it with three or among in three levels, right? So three levels of analysis. Um, we can first talk about the population levels. Uh, and the population level deals with changes and these consistencies, these constancies that apply more or less to everybody. Um, so basically, how we all kind of change in the same way. Earlier, we talked about how people will tend to become more conservative as we get older. That tends to be a population level of analyses. When we take a look at even, say, Freud's theory, the psychosocial development or psychosexual development, um, this idea of Freud that we go through these different stages of um, psychosexual development, which we'll get to later in the semester. He says, no, we all go through this, right? This applies to everybody. In fact, according to Freud, pretty much all mental illness can be explained by some problem or some issue or dilemma that exists in one of these psychosexual stages of development. So he tries to explain all human behavior um, with psychoanalysis. Um, when it comes to group level differences, this deals with changes and constancies that affect different groups differently. So, what do we mean by this? Well, the easiest, or say, where a lot of the research exists in terms of group differences or studying personality development on a group level, deals with gender differences. Um, and of course, we have to keep in mind most of this research is approach gender from a binary perspective. So we're talking men and women, right? Um, so when we take a look at how, let's say, young boys versus how young girls develop in terms of personalities or some of the gender differences that emerge. Um, as a group, men and women, or young boys and young girls, uh, tend to develop very differently, very suddenly, right? Because puberty kicks in, and there are different hormones involved, and there are different secondary sex characteristics that are emerging, and the different behaviors will start to emerge as well. Um, so we see, for instance, that men will tend to become much more risk taking. They'll tend to be much more, I want to say careless. I guess, yeah, will be much more adventurous, or will involve themselves in more risky behaviors. We see much more risk taking behavior uh, develop in adolescent men, right, and adolescent boys, than we do in girls. at that age. We also see a shift in the manifestation of aggression. So males will also, during this time period of puberty, and will will become more aggressive and engage in much more risk taking types of behaviors. Uh, so there that's an example of how we can examine personality changes in terms of group level type of differences. Again, there's always exception to the rule, um, but we could look at different groups and see how personality might develop within within these particular groups. Like I said, most of the research on personality development on the group level tends to look at gender differences. Also, we got in the individual difference level. So you can take a look at the population, how we change or stay the same as a population. So pretty much everybody. Then at the group level, so different segments of society, and then at the individual level. So the individual level of analysis is going to focus on individual differences in personality development. Um, Makes sense since it's the individual difference level, right? So, um, an example of this type of analysis might be, can we predict based on their personalities which individuals might go through a midlife crisis, for example? Um, I say that might be kind of a bad example because most of us will tend to have some kind of midlife crisis, existential crisis, some kind of breakdown. I think that's more of a population level type of thing, but maybe a severe midlife crisis, right? Um, Based on personality, can we determine which individuals are going to go through divorce, or which individuals might become ultra conservative or ultra liberal in their views. Basically, can we predict which individuals over time will change, and which ones are going to stay relatively the same? So we're starting to, at the individual level, also starting to get into this idea of stability, right? Um, are some traits, personality traits, more stable than others? It's a good question. Um, Speaking of which, here we go, right? So, personality stability over time. Um, there's probably no issue in personality development that is uh, that has been more extensively examined, more thoroughly examined than the question of whether personality traits remain stable over time. It's kind of controversial when you think about it, especially when we get to the next chapter. The next chapter deals with the genetic components of personality. So it's a controversial topic, but it kind of is at the heart of even the idea that personality traits exist, or that there is such a thing as personality. Uh, the idea is that, yeah, we do have these traits that tend to stay the same over time or consistent over time. That we say tend because, of course, there'll be changes, and this chapter looks at how personality traits and their manifestations might change over time. But there's been a lot of research that has gone into whether these traits are stable, whether they stick around, if they're with us forever. And many parents, even parents of twins, will tell you that if they had a particularly difficult child at birth, you know that they're pretty much the same way throughout their childhood, maybe even into adulthood. And I bring up the issue of twins, for two reasons. Was that if it were solely environmental, right? This is where the idea of nature and nurture comes in. If it were solely environmental factors that were affecting personality, twins should have the same personality, more or less, right? But even though identical twins will parents will report, that they have very different personalities in some aspects, and then of course some traits are remarkably similar as well. um, so when we take a look at the type of research that's been done, a lot of the research that examines the stability of personality actually starts with uh, examining temperament in infants. And when we talk about temperament, the idea of temperament for uh, you know many personality theorists or psychologists is that these individual differences that emerge, um, they emerge very early in life, and that there is a genetic component to it. We inherit these types of differences, and these um, individual differences are essentially behaviors that are linked to emotionality. So, um, again, this idea kind of bothers me a little bit, right? Well, I'll get to that, I guess, in a minute, or maybe wait until the next chapter when we talk about genetics in there. But there is this idea that you're able to determine an infant's personality, or basically the person that they're going to become, or the person that they're going to grow into, right? Based on their temperament as an infant, as a baby. Um, there's research to support it, so I can't totally poo-poo it. It's just, I guess, it makes me a little uncomfortable. Maybe we can discuss when we meet as a class. We can discuss how that idea sits with some of you. I'd like to hear your opinions about that. But when during the study of temperament, there are a number of things that personality psychologists will look for. Um, so when we take a look at, say, studying personality characteristics in infancy, um, this idea of temperament typically includes several factors. So the first is activity level. So that one is kind of self-explanatory. So are they a hyper type of child, or are they more chill, right? And this is supposed to help establish what kind of person this child not just will become, but what type of person this child is before they really have any uh, language to express who they are, or words or adjectives or any of that stuff to express who they are. But I'll stop judging and just get to the facts here. um, so personality psychologists will want to examine activity level, smiling and laughter. So kids generally happy. Kids easy to laugh, get to laugh, easy to entertain, right? Um, Fear. So if kids are um, more scared, than others, right? This might be a sign of neuroticism later in life. Um, Distress to limitation. So this essentially deals with how a child reacts to being said no, being told no, right? How a child might really react to being confined, so being left in a crib or in a playpen, kind of let's say prevented from doing what they want to do, or prevented from playing with certain things that they want to play with. How do they react to these types of limitations that are placed on them? Do they throw tantrums? Are they more accepting of these limitations? Do they try to find ways around these limitations? These are all things that might give us an idea of what kind of person that they might become later in life, when, or at least how they might react later in life when they're faced with limitations. Soothability. So, how easy is it, or how difficult it is, to soothe or to calm a distressed child, right? Or infant at this point. We're not even talking children, we're talking babies at this point. So, if a child is more easy to soothe, doesn't take a whole lot to get them to stop crying. This might be indicative of a certain type of personality that they have, or will manifest later in life. Say versus a child who is more difficult to soothe, more difficult to get stop crying. Um, this might tell us something about their emotionality, and how they deal with emotions, or and how they will deal with emotions later in life. And then finally, duration of orienting. So when we talk about the duration of orienting, this is the degree to which the child will sustain attention to objects in the absence of sudden changes. So basically, we're talking about attention level at this point, right? So activity level, how active a child might be, uh, how often they smile and laugh, or how easy it is to get them to smile or laugh, how they react to fear, what makes them fearful, how they react to limitations placed on their behaviors, um, how easy it is to comfort them, and uh, their duration of orienting, or how um, how easy is it for them to keep focus, or to keep their attention. Um, some of the research points to the following conclusions. So these are some of the research findings that have come out of very extensive and very well done research involving temperament and infants. So, stable individual differences tend to emerge early in life, when they can be assessed by observers, and um, that basically means that these personality differences, these individual differences, are seen very early in life, and they're noticed. Not Doesn't take a psychologist to notice them. The parents are noticing them as well. Also, for most temperament variables, there are moderate levels of stability over time during the first year of life. So they tend to, during the first year of life, even when a personality, we would say, is personality development is in its infancy, no pun intended. These type of temperament traits seem to be relatively or moderately stable during the first year of life. Also, stability of temperament is higher over short intervals of time than over long intervals. So this is saying that there is a stability of temperament, but in the long run, they become less stable over time. So there's room for change, right? There's room for development and room for growth. So these measures of stability tend to be more reliable over shorter periods of time. And level of stability of temperament increases as infants mature. Uh, so temperament will basically, well, kind of what we were saying earlier, or how we started this lecture. We kind of become set in our ways as we get older, and that seems to be increasingly true. So, as we become more mature, um, we tend to become more stable in terms of who we are, and our personality uh, states, particularly temperament in this research involving children, tends to become more stable and more reliable. Okay, so we can take a look at this chart here. And this chart deals with or lists stability correlations for different temperament scales. Um, and in one study, I'm just going to read off some notes here, just to make sure that I get this right in terms of what the researchers actually did. But in one study, the caregivers, and in this study, it was mostly women or mothers of the children, not researchers, but the mothers themselves, completed observer-based scales that were designed to measure these six different aspects of temperament. So, activity level, smiling, laughter, fear, distress to limitation, soothability, duration of orienting. So the different temperament measures or factors that we just discussed in there. So this table shows the cross-time correlations over different time intervals. And if we look at these correlations, we see that they're all positive. Some are stronger than others, clearly, right? But they're all going in the same direction. They're all related. They're all positively correlated. So this means that infants who tend to score high at one time, or during one time period, say on the activity level or the smiling and laughter level, will also tend to score higher at a different time period. Um, However, though, we see that the correlations in the top two rows here, activity level and smiling, these tend to be higher than the bottom four rows, right? So if remember correlation, this is a quick reminder, can go from -1 to +1. -1 is perfect negative correlation, which means as one variable goes up, the other one goes down. A +1 correlation is the perfect positive correlation, which means that as one variable goes up, the same another variable goes up the same exact amount, right? And a correlation of 0 means that there's no relationship at all. So we see in the first two rows there that the correlations are actually higher than in the bottom rows, at least for some of these 3 to 6, 3 to 9, 3 to 12 month ones. Um, so it suggests that the that say activity level and smiling and laughter might actually have more stability over time than some of these other um, factors of temperament, which suggests that these might have more of a genetic component or more of an internal component than say these bottom four, which might be more susceptible to change based on environment or say the nurture aspect. Um, we can also notice that the correlations in the oops, just trying to move my head out of here so you can see this. I know I'm blocking this value here, but that's 0.64. But if we take a look at these two columns here to the right, we can see that these correlations tend to be higher as well, right? So we see in the top two rows, they tend to be higher than those in the bottom four. So activity level, smiling and laughter tend to show higher levels of stability over time. The correlations in the rightmost two columns are generally higher than those in these columns. So this suggests that personality traits tend to become more stable towards the end of infancy, which typically is, well, here, 9 to 12 months, right? So overall, what is this saying? Well, it's saying there's a moderate degree of stability for these personality traits, or these factors rather, of temperament throughout infancy, particularly for activity level, smiling and laughter. They tend to be stronger than these other factors here. But all of the factors tend to be stronger towards the end of infancy. So they tend to be more stable. So essentially, as a child is, or infant is reaching 12 months, reaching 1 year, these temperament traits tend to be pretty stable. I mean, it's all how we want to interpret these correlations. 0.72, 0.68, 0.61, 0.65. You know, these are moderate to high correlations. If we want to know how much they actually predict behavior, we'd want to square them, and that number will go down quite a bit. But the overall point is that temperament tends to be pretty stable, particularly towards the end of infancy. Now, of course, looking at my notes here, it says mention this limitation. So, of course, all studies have limitations associated with them. So perhaps most important, the infant's caregivers may have developed certain types of conceptions of their kids. Here, plugs are going to bother me the whole time here. Remember that these were mothers who were in this particular study who were doing the measurements. So they're going to be biased, particularly over a long period of time as they're getting to know their kids, know their babies, quote unquote. They might kind of develop a sense of how they might have developed a sense of their children's personalities to begin with, and then they were relying on confirmation bias essentially after that. So they already pegged their kids as being pretty active and pretty happy-go-lucky. You know, they might be more inclined to pay attention to the behaviors that match their idea that their kids are active and happy-go-lucky, and ignore the behaviors or behaviors or temperaments of their children who don't really fit their preconceived notions. So big limitation of these types of studies is you know, you're having parents, particularly mothers, as the primary caregivers, also serving as the people who are collecting the data on their own babies, right? So lots of room for potential bias in there. But continuing along with this, there have been plenty of other longitudinal studies that examine the same groups of individuals over time. So longitudinal studies will take one group of people, particularly kids. Longitudinal studies are used frequently, or let's say often, in developmental research, uh, for obvious reasons, right? If you want to see how things develop or how people develop, you're gonna want to study them over a long period of time. Um, so these types of longitudinal studies have also shown um, stability in personality traits existing over childhood. So the block and block longitudinal study, this had a sample of over 100 kids that were repeatedly tested. So they were tested at ages 4, 5, 7, 11, and into their adulthood. And one study using this block and block longitudinal study was looking at individual differences in activity level. And activity level was assessed in two different ways in this study. One was using the ectometer, and we spoke about the ectometer when we were talking about the different research methods that were used in, or that are used in studying personality. And this is a mechanical device that is used to measure an individual's activity level. Um, so by using this octometer, it basically provides a less subjective. It's a more objective way of measuring activity level rather than asking a child's parent to report activity levels. Let's say. So using the octometer and personality ratings that were provided by teachers. Teachers are certainly not free of bias, that's for sure, but they might be a little bit less biased than, say, the child's mother or father, right? Um, and it examined stability coefficients in terms of how stable were these traits into childhood, right? Ages 4 through 11 into adulthood here. So when we talk about stability coefficients, we're talking about the correlations between measures that are obtained at two different points in time. Um, so it's correlation between, if you're familiar with this idea of test-retest reliability, is basically asking whether our measure is stable over time. So if I measure you now, let's say this first exam that you're going to be taking in the class, um, and then I give you that same test a year from now, um, and I calculate the correlation between the scores, I would get a stability coefficient. And it wouldn't be about your personality, but it would be about your retention of the information in this class. And yeah, there's no surprise here that we tend to forget most of the, especially after a year, we tend to forget, most of the details that we actually get tested on. So uh, I try to teach every undergraduate class really is just an introduction to the field of psychology. So if you can walk away from this class, and all classes that I teach at least, and hopefully all classes that you take as a undergrad, um, psych major, with the big themes, the big questions, then I'm happy, right? Because then you get to explore the details in grad school, and you don't even figure out the answers to any of that stuff in grad school. You're gonna have to do your own research to find out the answers. Grad school just gives you the tools to figure out your the answers, right? Grad schools for learning how to do research in there. Um, so we got these stability coefficients, but we also have validity coefficients. So stability coefficients, how how much do these traits remain constant or remain stable over time? When it comes to validity coefficients, these are correlations between different measures of the same trait that are obtained at the same time. So again, when we talk about whether or not something is reliable, we're asking whether or not something is stable. So when we talk about stability coefficients, we're talking about reliability, right? Are these traits reliable? Or are we going to see the same traits over time? They're going to kind of be consistent over time, over different situations, so on and so forth. When it comes to validity, we're asking, are we measuring what we say that we're measuring? So an example given here is this level of activity, right? Uh, when we ask people to judge a child or even an adult's level of activity, how can we be sure that they're really measuring level of activity? And what kind of activity are we talking about? Are we talking about physical activity? Because we also have mental activity, right? And lots of thinking going on, and or reading a book or solving a crossword puzzle is a lot of activity, but it's not physical activity. So we have to be clear about that. The octometer is made or designed to measure physical activity, and it's often used in conjunction with observer ratings of level of activity as a way to have, let's say, an inter-rater type of reliability. Is that you're using more than just one measure for some of these personality traits. So it adds more validity to the personality trait itself. You're basically saying, well, we're measuring, activity level in more than one way, and if both of those ways match up, then we're talking about um, something being more likely to have validity than something that is only measured in one way, or when you do try to measure it using different measures, uh, you're getting different results. So when we talk about validity coefficients, two ways of measuring the same thing, and we want them to match. We want them to match up. Okay, so we see that activity level measurements are all, well, I'm gonna show you a chart here in a moment, a graph here in a moment that takes a look at correlation coefficients over time when it um, comes to some of these personality traits in terms of stability. But activity level measurements are all positively correlated with measures of activity level taken at later ages. So activity level tends to be pretty stable over time. So from infancy across these various ages where the study examined children into early adulthood even, and the size of correlations tends to decrease as the time interval between different testing into increases. So in other words, the there is a level of stability, but it tends to decrease, or the correlation the correlation between these two measures becomes less strong the longer that you wait. So that's suggesting that there is some change or some drop off that is happening over extended period of times. So I don't feel that I described this slide in the best uh, the best way possible. So let me just summarize this all just to make sense, and so you get the big picture here. When it comes to stability in childhood, a number of longitudinal studies have looked at this, and these traits, particularly activity level and smiling, laughter, tend to be pretty stable. Even when we take a look at the block and block studies, right, measuring people at or children at age 4, 5, 7, and 11, and into adulthood, and also not just measuring activity level by observer ratings, but also using the sectometer. We see that the traits tend to be relatively stable, but they will become less stable the longer you go. Meaning the traits are pretty stable, but there tends to be, somewhat of a change over time, right? And we can see this kind of in this slide here. So this graph depicts the stability coefficients for aggression as a function of the interval between the first and the final testing. So time intervals in years, the stability coefficients for aggression. So how well are those two measures, or how well is these two measures of the first time tested and the last time tested, how how correlated are they? You can see in the shorter period of times, right? They're pretty high up there. Those correlations between the first time testing aggression and the second time testing aggression are pretty strong, but they tend to get weaker the more you wait, right? So let's say a correlation between testing a kid's aggression at 1 year old, 1 years old versus 21. The correlation is only a zero point 0.4, but testing that kid at 1 year old and then testing them at 5 years old, that correlation looks to be about 0.7 ish, right? If we follow this line of best fit. So they remain correlated, which means that the trait seems to still be there, tends to be relatively stable, just not as strong. It just tends to drop off. So there tends, or it appears that there's a change over time. So here we go, personality stability over time. Um, so the stability of childhood aggression. Um, Again, we're talking about the personality trait of aggression, not the way that it's manifested, not the way that people will express this trait of aggression. But some of the research findings show that individual differences in aggression tend to emerge pretty early in life, and definitely by the age of 3. So by age of 3, we can probably tell, who's going to be the aggressive people and who will be the less aggressive people or the more passive people. Also, individuals tend to retain their rank order stability on aggression over many years. So wherever we fit within our cohort or our group, or even say within a family unit, right? When we talk about rank order stability, it could be within any group that we're talking about. Um, Even if our group, our peers, our cohort gets less aggressive, we tend to get less aggressive proportional to the rest of the cohort. Or if they get more aggressive, we tend to get more aggressive um, in relation to the cohort, in proportion to the cohort. Excuse me. And also, stability coefficients decline as the interval between two time measurements increase, which we saw last time, or we saw in that last chart. The longer that you wait, between the first measure of aggression and later measures of aggression, uh, you'll see less of a correlation in terms of this trait being stable, which means we do change somewhat over time, right? The trait seems to still be there, but maybe not as strong or as weak as it was. Um, in terms of this rank order stability in adulthood, what happens when we're getting into to our 20s, 30s, 40s? Um, well, across self-reported or different self-reported measures of personality, remember the issues that might arise with self-reports. Um, well, there's issues with all methods of measuring something like personality. Self-reports are very common, but across these different self-report measures conducted by investigators over differing time intervals, anywhere from 3 years to 30 years, broad personality traits show moderate to high levels of stability. Um, so once we are getting into adulthood, not a whole lot of change going on in there, right? We saw with what we were just talking about among infants, um, there tends to be stability, but there that stability gets a little less reliable, or gets those coefficients get a little less strong um, the longer that you go into infancy, right? But once we start reaching adulthood, um, these personality traits tend to be pretty high or moderate in terms of their stability. So average correlation across traits, scales, and time intervals is about 0.65. Uh, that's pretty good, right? I mean, as a social psychologist, I deal with correlations and regression coefficients and the 0.3. So 0.65, that's definitely a moderate to high correlation that exists. Also, stability is found in spouse reports and peer reports. So we're actually getting multiple measures, right? We're getting that those we calculate validity coefficients here. We're using different measures. It's not just self-reports, but your partners, your spouses, and also your friends and family, maybe even your coworkers, are all kind of reporting the same types of information about your personality, and their reports tend to stay pretty similar as well. Also, personality consistency tends to increase in a linear fashion with age. In other words, we become more stubborn, less likely to change um, as we get older, right? Um, yep. So, as I said there, last point, personality appears to become more and more set with age. So we become more and more set in our ways as we get older. When we take a look at the mean level stability and change in adulthood, the big five personality factors that we talked about, I believe, last time show a consistent mean level stability over time. So, taking a look at those big, or the big five personality factors, there's been a lot of research on the big five model, and the research on the big five model tends to be very statistical in nature, very research based. So seeing that there's this consistent mean level stability over time with the big five is pretty significant, because the big five were actually not based on theory. They were extracted as factors in a factor analysis from data, right? So there tends to be very little change in the average level of stability after age 50. So seems like I got about 10 more years to develop, and then I'm gonna be whoever I am, right? After that. Um, and there are small but consistent changes that exist in personality, especially during the 20s, or on yeah, during early 20s, particularly. So the research has shown that among the big five personality characteristics, openness, extroversion, and neuroticism tend to decline with age until around 50. So we tend to become a little less open to new experiences. We tend to become a little less extroverted and a little less neurotic until around age 50. And then by age 50, there's really not a whole lot of change going on. Conscientiousness and agreeableness show gradual increase over time, however. So, at least when it comes to openness, extroversion, and neuroticism, we'll see declines in those up until age 50. Then not much change, but when it comes to conscientiousness and agreeableness, um, those tend to increase over time. And those are two qualities, if you remember from our last lecture, that make, well, these two qualities and the fact that they tend to increase with age is what makes senior citizens and the elderly particularly vulnerable to scams and scam artists. Um, this graph just shows mean level stability in terms of adulthood. It's only starting at age 30 here. I wish it actually went back to age 20 because in the 20s there is some changes going on. But I think that the point of this graph is to kind of show you uh, that particularly after age 50, there's so not a whole lot of change happening in here. But if this went back a little bit more on the x-axis to age 20, I think we would see a little bit more differences there. So tend to stabilize in terms of neuroticism, extroversion, openness up until age 50 or so. And then agreeableness and conscientiousness, these two lines tend to increase slightly into our 80s at least. Um, Personality change related to changes in self-esteem from adolescence to adulthood. Well, adolescence kind of sucks for everybody in terms of self-esteem, that's for sure. Uh, Everyone has something about them that they would like to change. In adolescence, that's usually focused on body type of issues because there's tons of body changes that are going on during that time. But this transition from adolescence to early adulthood appears to, excuse me, be harder on women than it is on men in terms of self-esteem. So we see that young women will tend to experience a decrease in self-esteem, whereas men will tend to experience an increase in self-esteem going into early adulthood. Um, Again, the social psychologist in me could explain this based on sexism that exists in our society and gender role expectations that exist in our society. But coming from a personality theory perspective, again, these are things that exist within us, right? But I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that, well, not that I'm not convinced, I'm pretty sure there's some social factors involved in that as well. When we take a closer look at this kind of day-to-day changes in self-esteem, remember what self-esteem is. It's how we feel about ourselves. More specifically, it's when we take a look at self-esteem if we take a look at it from the perspective of uh, the discrepancy theory, right? Discrepancy theory basically says we have an ideal self. There's who we want to be, who is, that's that person's way up here, and then we have our actual self, who might be down here. But the discrepancy between our ideal self and our actual self is what's going to influence our self-esteem the most. Not just how big the difference is, but how much we focus on the difference and how much that difference actually really matters to us. But there are certainly things that happen on a day-to-day basis or um, within a short period of time to boost our self-esteem, and we can actually do things to boost our self-esteem, at least temporarily as well. So when we talk about self-esteem being variable, of course it is. I mean, it's a human trait, so it's going to fluctuate just like anything else fluctuates. So we take a look at the magnitude of short-term changes in ongoing self-esteem, and these might be an indicator of vulnerability in stressful life events. So um, people whose self-esteem might fluctuate more might actually have a more difficult time dealing with stress, particularly major stressful events like getting fired or getting divorced or um, losing a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a significant other. Um, so people who fluctuate in terms of their day-to-day type of self-esteem might actually be less prepared to deal with let's say major events that could threaten self-esteem. This is also related to the extent to which one's self view can be influenced by events such as social events. So at least in this regard, personality theory is taking into account the importance of social events, but it's also saying that this self-esteem fluctuation is something that some of us are just inherently more likely to have, right? Some of us are more likely to fluctuate between high or low self-esteem, or our self-esteem is just more likely to be um, less stable than others. And this can affect how we deal with major life events, and also how social events, the little types of day-to-day social events can influence our self-esteem or how we feel about ourselves. In terms of flexibility and impulsivity as personality traits, um, when we take a look at individuals in general, people in general, um, there tends to be a marked decrease in impulsivity in impulsivity and flexibility with age. So we become less impulsive. We could consider that as we become more measured, um, maybe more rational, less impulsive, but also less flexible. So we become more rigid as we get older. So this suggests that with age, people tend to become less impulsive, but more fixed in their ways, which kind of true there, right? Well, speaking from personal experience, at least. When it comes to the traits of autonomy and dominance, leadership, ambition, um, this actually can break down in terms of take a look at this through the lens of gender here. Um, in one longitudinal study of male managerial candidates, uh, people will tend to be, let's say, men, uh, will tend to express more autonomy and dominance and leadership, more ambition, particularly um, in their early 20s. Um, and in this study, they measured men first in their early 20s and then followed up with them periodically over a 20-year span, basically until men were in their 40s. And what did they find? Well, among men anyway, there was actually a decrease or decline in ambition. Um, so the steepness in decline was during the first 8 years of this managerial job, but it continued to drop for the next 12 years. So essentially, at least when it came to men in these types of managerial positions, much more ambitious and autonomous in their early 20s, and that continued to decline very rapidly in the first 8 years, but continued to decline over 12 years as well. So we will become less ambitious as we get older, and that goes along with this idea of settling down, right? Settling down and kind of taking it easy as we get older. Supplementary interviews suggested that men became more realistic about their limited possibilities for promotion in the company. Um, so that's actually kind of interesting, right? Because it wasn't necessarily a this decline in ambition wasn't necessarily what we think of in terms of working at any job for 20 years, is that it just beats you down. It wasn't that these people were becoming, so the word I'm looking for, demoralized or anything. But they were just becoming more realistic. They realized, okay, I'm probably never going to be CEO, and that's okay. We're cool with that, right? I'm never going to be a billionaire. uh, that's okay, right? So part of this might just be wisdom and learned experience, right? Longer that you're in that position, the more you know how this game works, and the more likely you are to I don't want to say settle for stuff, but I don't know, there's nothing necessarily wrong with settling for something if it's going to make you happy or less stressed out, right? When it comes to autonomy, leadership, motivation, achievement, um, dominance, these tend to increase over time. However, in different ways. When we speak about leadership and autonomy and stuff like that, even motivation, they tend to take on different forms the longer that you're at a job, let's say, because this study is dealing with a workplace type of environment. The leadership and autonomy, you're kind of granted more autonomy because you're getting older. People tend to have more respect for you because you've been there long enough. So they kind of assume that you know what you're doing, or even if they know that you don't know what you're doing, you're still kind of like an elder in some regard. um, and that leadership and even that motivation aspect might be tied to more of a mentorship type of role that comes with wisdom. You kind of understand how things work. Now, of course, the way I'm talking right now is kind of like a social psychologist, but I think it's related in this way. So people who are just naturally, say, motivated, who are naturally dominant, um, over time, remember that trait doesn't disappear, but the way it manifests might change, right? So instead of dominant trying to undermine other colleagues, this that trait of dominance might come out as, being the wise one and being the mentor type of person in the job place. So these types of traits might increase, but the way that they come about, the way that they are expressed, might actually change. Sensation seeking, this decreases with age. Once we get older. From childhood to adolescence, though, sensation seeking is on the rise. We're looking for new experiences. Sensation seeking tends to peak in late adolescence, so 18 to 20 is about the time where you'll have your peak sensation seeking, and it tends to fall more or less continuously after age 20. So, if you're feeling now like you have all these things that you want to do in life, now's a good time to do them. Chances are you still might want to do them later in life, but you'll say, nah, might as well spend the money on this, or don't have time for that, or can't take other stuff gets in the way, particularly if you have kids, right? So sensation seeking will tend to drop. So instead of going out and partying at a rave for 2 or 3 days with no sleep, you might be fine just staying in and watching Netflix with half a gallon of ice cream or something, right? When it comes to femininity, which we can think of as a personality trait, in the sense that all of us have both masculine and feminine qualities. This one study, though, however, took a look at women, and this was a longitudinal study of women. So women were examined for changes in this personality trait of femininity between their early 40s and early 50s, and there was a consistent drop in femininity as women moved from their early 40s to their early 50s. So make of that what you will. Again, the notion of femininity and masculinity are social constructs. There's really no way around that, right? We label certain behaviors as feminine and certain behaviors as masculine, even though we, have a mixture of both. Hopefully, it's a healthy mixture of both feminine and masculine qualities. But at least in this Mills College study, women from their early 40s to early 50s within that decade tend to have experienced a drop in femininity, or displayed less of those traditional feminine behaviors, or behaviors that we label as feminine. Independence and traditional roles. So continuing with the Mills study on women, they were also these women were assessed for independence, which was defined as self-assurance, resourcefulness, competence, distancing from others, and not bowing to conventional demands for society. For divorced mothers, non-mothers, and working mothers, independence scores increased over time. For traditional homemakers, there didn't seem to show any increase in independence over time. Um, just because of the state of our economy, the idea of the traditional homemaker is kind of disappearing. In order to just have a mortgage on a house, both people, both partners need to work full-time jobs, sometimes full-time, two full-time jobs, or full-time and a part-time job here. So we see that between 40 and 50, women tend to decrease in terms of traditional feminine traits. but increased more in terms of independence, at least for divorced moms or divorced mothers, um, non-mothers, or women who don't have kids, didn't have kids, and working mothers. Um, Cohort effect. So this is an interesting um, area to study. Again, controversial and something I'm sure you're very familiar with, especially with all the boomer memes that have been going around here. So when we talk about cohort effects, we're talking about changes over time that are attributable to living in different time periods. So these are not necessarily real personality changes, meaning that they probably don't come from some genes or some biological thing inside of us. Um, they they just emerge because of the times that we're living in. So boomers are often seen as being selfish, right? Um, Gen Xers, I'm right on the cusp of being a Gen Xer and a millennial. I think by 2 years. By 2 years, I'm a Gen Xer. We're seen as being depressed and nihilistic, and have a real like fuck it type of attitude. Um, Millennials, we know the stereotypes associated with millennials being entitled, being snowflakes, getting participation ribbon for things, and then we have the Gen Z, Generation Z, which probably most of you belong to. Um, those of you taking this class, and you're seen as being more socially liberal and actually being more activist than pretty much any generation. I mean, the boomers, before they became the boomers, they were the hippies, right? So they were pretty active as well. The Gen X, we did our fair share of protesting and demonstrations and stuff as well. But um, Generation Z tends to be more global. They grew up with technology. They grew up with being able to talk to anyone in the world at any time. So having these say technological advances or these abilities will certainly have an effect on how somebody develops as a person. Um, when it comes to personality coherence, so personality coherence over time, um, what do we mean by coherence? Well, we're really talking about predictable changes in the manifestations or outcomes of personality factors over time, even if that underlining characteristic remains the same. So, again, as we said before, something like aggression uh, is a personality trait, and it might stay stable, just the way it is expressed might change, right? So when we're talking about coherence, we're really looking at not whether the personality trait is changing, but rather if how the trait is expressed is changing. And we do see some research here. Again, longitudinal type of studies. This one here, Kelly and Conley, um, took a look at marital stability, excuse me, excuse me, marital satisfaction and divorce over a period of time, quite a long period of time, 50 years. So they took a look at or studied 300 couples from their engagements in the 1930s all the way through to the 1980s, and some pretty interesting findings in here. Um, During the first testing sessions in the 1930s, friends rated each participant's personality on several dimensions. Um, also part of this study, they did a section of self-reports and spousal reports, the people that they were marrying. So three aspects of personality emerged as very strong predictors of marital dissatisfaction and divorce over time. And that was the husband's neuroticism, husband's lack of impulse control, and wife's neuroticism. So we can take from this that husbands who have high neuroticism and have high impulsivity, uh, probably not good in terms of marital satisfaction or divorce. And of course, wife's neuroticism. You can imagine being married or in a relationship, even in a long-term friendship with someone high on neuroticism, would be difficult, right? And of course, impulse control can easily lead to abuse in relationships. Alcoholism and emotional disturbance. So, in a longitudinal study of men, high neuroticism predicted later development of alcoholism and emotional disturbance. Um, so we see that neuroticism, well, when we take a look at emotional disturbance, that might be directly related to neuroticism. Um, alcoholism is often used as alcohol is often used as self-medication, right? So people who are high in neuroticism and emotional disturbance, um, you know, this research or this finding is kind of treating alcoholism almost like a personality trait, and um, that's typically not how we think of alcoholism. We think of it as a disease. Um, so people high in neuroticism will likely experience high emotional disturbance, which can easily lead people to develop alcoholism, to rely on alcoholism, especially if there's a predisposition, a genetic predisposition for alcoholism. Also, men with alcoholism had lower impulse control than men with emotional disturbances. So it seems that you know alcoholism and emotional disturbances are not solely a function of bad impulse control. There's something else going on there, right? Because people who had alcoholism had lower impulse control than men with emotional disturbances. So um, they're not all necessarily measuring the same thing or tapping into the same thing. In terms of education and academic achievement, dropping out, among in this one study at least, it was 1971, so it's a bit old, but among low SAT scorers, there's no link between impulsivity and GPA. So those people who score low on the SAT, doesn't seem to be any link between impulsivity and how well they're going to do in terms of GPA in college. But among high SAT scorers, so those who scored highly on the SAT, impulsive people had consistently lower GPAs in comparison to less impulsive peers. So the SAT is usually used as a stand-in for an intelligence test. Um, I don't agree with that usage, but that's how it's often used and often interpreted. Um, so we can say, quote unquote, um, people who score higher in intelligence, higher on their SATs, but who are also impulsive will actually do worse in college compared to people who are higher in intelligence but less impulsive. Also, impulsive people are more likely than less impulsive people to flunk out of college, which makes sense, right? And if you tend to be an impulsive person, you tend to make decisions quickly without giving um, a whole lot of thought, or at least considering all the potential options. So, um, impulsive decision making typically is not positive, generally speaking, right? Um, in terms of adult outcomes of children with temper tantrums, so this is some interesting research, meaning, can we tell something about what kind of adult a child is going to be based on the kind of how often and the nature of the temper tantrums that they throw. And some of the research says yes, actually. So in this study, men who, as children, had frequent and severe temper tantrums achieved lower levels of education, lower occupational status at their jobs. They also changed jobs more frequently and had erratic work patterns. Now, let me just pause for 1 second here, because this is a study that was done in 1987. So this is still a pretty old study. Um, why do I mention this? Well, because when you take a look at the way the economy is set up now, or how it's set up, how it is now, um, lower occupational status is the norm. There, there's not a lot of great jobs out there. Um, to be had, number one. Number two, changing jobs is something that is done much more frequently nowadays than it was, say, in 1987. And I'm not even sure what they mean by erratic work patterns, but you could even just take the pandemic here as clearly being a cause of potential quote unquote erratic work patterns. But I bring this up only because, I think it's important that we don't judge, children, infants, based on temper tantrums, and try to. I'm concerned about prejudice, right? Prejudging people, especially based on the severity of their temper tantrums as kids, right? Um, but according to this research, it was, or this one study was associated with lower levels of education as well. But also, 1987 college education wasn't as important as it is now. So it'd be nice to see some newer research about this. But longitudinal studies take a long time. You got to wait for babies to get older, 20, 30 years, right? Um, in another study, or this might have still been Caspi's research, but in the military, men who had temper tantrums as children achieved lower military rank than their peers. Okay, we've all had temper tantrums, as not just only as children, but as adults. We have them. We're talking about the severity of them, the frequency of the temper tantrums. So we're getting back to this idea of temperament that we saw earlier in the lecture. Um, in terms of prediction of personality change, so can we predict who is likely to change in personality and who is likely to stay the same? Well, we see Caspi here and colleagues in 1990 studied middle-aged couples over an 11-year period from 1970, and then checked in again with them in 1981. And researchers asked if the choice of a marriage partner was a cause of marriage stability or change. Essentially, if you're going to be with this person for 20 years, or in this case 11 years, right? Um, how do they affect your personality? Do they actually make you more set in your personality, or do they actually make you less stable in your personality, more open to change in your personality? Well, people married to a spouse who was highly similar to themselves showed the most personality stability, and people married to a spouse least similar to themselves showed the most personality change. So there you go. If you don't like who you are as a person, marry someone who's completely opposite from you, right? So hopefully their personality will rub off on you, at least the good parts of it. And if you like who you are, generally speaking, go ahead and do what most of us do and marry someone who is very similar to you. Um, Remember, it's a myth that opposites attract. We tend to be attracted to people who are like us. Okay, so just to summarize this chapter, a lot of it was just going over different or various results from different studies in there, just to give us examples or give us plenty of examples of how personality stays the same and how it changes over time. So to summarize, personality development is the study of both the continuities and the changes in personality that take place over time. And there's strong evidence for personality rank order stability, which means that we, even as people are around us are changing in our personality and we're changing with them, we tend to still stay in the same order that we were in, even if we're moving forward or backwards on one of these personality traits. Also, personality can change in predictable ways and sometimes in different ways for men and women. Um, Part of that might be due to biological differences between men and women, but we see that the cognitive differences or brain differences between men and women tend to be pretty small. They exist in some degrees. Men are better at some cognitive tasks than women are, and women tend to be better at cognitive some other cognitive tasks than men are. Now, all of that gets mushy, gets all mixed up when we talk about transgender folk and when we talk about gays and lesbians and even bisexuals. Um, so lots of research to still be done there about how much of those changes between men and women are personality changes and how much of them are so based on societal stuff. Um, and finally, personality also shows evidence of coherence over time. So personality tends to stay the same even if it's expressed in different ways. So if you were aggressive as a kid, that might have come out as you being a childhood bully. Um, but as an adult, that aggression might still be there, and it might come out as you being kind of an asshole coworker or a very uh, micromanager type of boss or something like that. Okay, this is a long lecture, so I will stop talking. Um, I will see you next time when we'll talk about genetics and some of the controversies that surround genetics and genetic determinations or determinants of personality. Okay, take care, everyone.